Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into a topic that'll make you hug your shampoo bottle a little tighter and whisper sweet thanks to your indoor plumbing, Victorian hygiene. Yep, it's about to get weird, grimy, and absolutely fascinating. Picture grand gowns, cravats, and waistcoats. Now imagine all of that elegance layered over not-so-elegant reality. Because while the Victorians were obsessed with appearances, what was lurking underneath those stylish layers? Let's just say hygiene wasn't exactly keeping up with fashion. And hey, if you're into bizarre slices of history like this, drop a like or hit that subscribe button. Seriously, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Type it in the comments. Are you listening in a bubble bath? Ironically perfect. Let's begin. We tend to romanticize the 1800s, candlelight dinners, horse-drawn carriages. But what we often forget is the stench. And not poetic stench, real, biological, make-your-eyes-water stench. That hot shower you took today, that makes you a hygiene king or queen compared to most Victorians. First off, bathing, or rather, the lack of it. Many Victorians didn't bathe regularly. For the lower classes, full-body bathing might have happened once a month, if that. And even among the wealthy, bathing wasn't daily. Weekly at best, sometimes monthly. Their reasoning? They believed too much bathing could open the skin's pores to illness. Yes, in their minds, staying too clean could make you sick. When people did bathe, it was an ordeal. Water had to be fetched, heated on a stove, poured into a tin or wooden tub, sometimes placed in the kitchen. Privacy was a luxury, and the water? Shared. That's right. The whole family might take turns using the same bathwater, often in descending order of social status. So if you were the youngest sibling, sorry, you got the cold, grimy leftovers. Soap existed, but it was harsh. Made from animal fat and lye, it stung and stripped the skin. So people often avoided it altogether. Instead, they relied on dry brushing, perfumes, or powders to mask body odor. Imagine layering cologne over weeks of unwashed skin. That clean Victorian gentleman? Yeah, he probably smelled like musk, sweat, and desperation. Hair washing was even more sporadic. Some women only washed their hair once a month or less. They might sprinkle it with cornstarch or crushed lavender to absorb oil and odors, then brush it out. Men weren't much different. Greasy hair was normal. Dandruff? Part of the aesthetic. Teeth brushing? Rare. Toothpaste existed, but it was often made with brick dust, charcoal, or salt. Toothbrushes used pig bristles. Dental care was so rudimentary that people often opted to have teeth pulled rather than treated. Wealthy Victorians sometimes had full sets of false teeth, often made from ivory, porcelain, or, wait for it, the teeth of the dead. Dentists called them Waterloo teeth because many came from corpses on battlefields. Let that sink in. Let's talk about bathrooms or their absence. Indoor plumbing wasn't common, especially for the working class. Instead, most homes relied on chamber pots or outdoor privies. A chamber pot was essentially a bowl kept under the bed, used for nighttime needs. In the morning, someone, often a servant, would empty it into a cesspit or street gutter. Yes, human waste was regularly dumped right outside. If you've ever wondered why cobblestone streets were so filthy, that's why. Public toilets were rare, and when they did exist, they weren't places you'd want to linger. Early toilets didn't flush well, smelled atrocious, and attracted flies. Sewage systems were primitive. In many cities, waste flowed directly into rivers or the street. London's Thames became so polluted by human waste that, in 1858, the smell alone forced Parliament to shut down. They called it the Great Stink. To combat the smell, people carried small bouquets of flowers, called nosegays, or scented handkerchiefs. These weren't just accessories, they were survival tools. The air was so foul that folks held perfumed cloth to their noses when walking through the streets. Now let's zoom in on personal hygiene habits. Underwear wasn't changed daily. In fact, many people only owned 1 or 2 sets. Laundering was labor-intensive, so underclothes were worn repeatedly. Sweat built up. Stains remained. Wool and linen absorbed body odor like sponges. And menstruation? Victorian women had almost no access to the hygiene products we take for granted. Disposable pads and tampons didn't exist. Instead, women used cloth rags, which were washed and reused. These rags were often referred to euphemistically as monthly cloths. There were no painkillers, no heat packs, no chocolate stashes, just grit and endurance. Talking openly about menstruation was taboo, so girls often entered womanhood without understanding what was happening to them. Deodorant wasn't a thing. Commercial antiperspirants wouldn't become available until the 20th century. So body odor was just accepted. People smelled. Everyone did. You dealt with it. And here's a fun fact. Many Victorians believed bad smells caused disease. Not germs, not bacteria, just odors. This miasma theory held that foul air spread sickness. So cities invested in covering smells rather than addressing sanitation. Hence the obsession with perfume, incense, and airing out rooms. Speaking of rooms, let's talk about bed hygiene. Mattresses were stuffed with hay, straw, or horsehair. They attracted lice, fleas, and bedbugs. People tried to manage these pests with smoke, herbs, or sheer denial. Baths in mercury were sometimes used to treat lice, but that usually poisoned the patient. Clothing hygiene wasn't much better. Outfits were rarely washed. Outer garments, especially for the wealthy, were expensive and delicate. Washing them risked damage. So instead, people wore the same clothes day after day. Stains were hidden under lace, ruffles, or dark fabrics. Odors were masked with sachets sewn into garments. Children didn't get a pass either. They were rarely bathed, and their hygiene was often an afterthought. Many infants died from infections we'd easily prevent today, simply because basic cleanliness wasn't practiced. Midwives and doctors didn't wash their hands between patients. Germ theory, remember, was still on the scientific fringe. So what did cleanliness mean to Victorians? It was more moral than physical. Being clean meant being proper, modest, and pious, not necessarily washed. You could smell terrible, but as long as your clothes were neat and your manners prim, you were socially acceptable. Still feeling nostalgic for the 1800s? Let's close with this. We like to think we've come a long way, and we have. But the next time you groan about your 10-minute shower or grumble over laundry day, remember the chamber pots, the flea-ridden mattresses, the lice combs, and the monthly cloths. Then look around your clean, plumbed, disinfected world and whisper a quiet thank you to modern hygiene. Open a window onto a Victorian street, and what would you see? Likely a pile of garbage fermenting in the sun, spreading a stench that mingled with the smoke and soot of the city. Rotten food, dead animals, broken crockery. It was all dumped outside, left to attract rats, flies, and disease. But garbage was just one piece of the sanitation puzzle. Human waste? That's a whole different level of filth. Toilets were a rarity. The vast majority of homes, especially working-class ones, had no indoor plumbing. Instead, people relied on chamber pots, essentially open bowls kept under beds for nighttime use. Come morning, someone, often the unfortunate housewife or a servant, had to empty the pot. Where? Into a backyard cesspit if you were proper. Into a shared outhouse if you were lucky. But more often, straight out the window and onto the street. Yes, seriously. And this wasn't done discreetly. People would yell a warning, "Gardaloo," in some cities, as they dumped contents from a second-floor window onto the unsuspecting street below. Entire neighborhoods stank. Cesspools, holes in the ground meant to collect waste, would overflow. When that happened, you had to call in the night soil men. These were the unsung, underpaid, and absolutely indispensable laborers who crept through the city at night, shoveling out human excrement by the ton. They worked with little more than lanterns, wooden buckets, and sheer willpower. Their job? To prevent literal crap from drowning entire communities. Glamorous, right? It wasn't just homes. Workplaces, schools, taverns. Most had no running water. Factories often dumped waste directly into nearby rivers or streets. The Thames, once a vital water source, became so contaminated with sewage and industrial runoff that it turned black and viscous in the summer heat. Fish died. So did people. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery swept through cities with terrifying frequency. People didn't understand germs yet. Instead, they blamed foul air, miasma, for disease. This led to public health responses focused more on smell than sanitation. Lime was poured into cesspools to reduce odor. Vinegar was sprinkled in the air. Streets were aired out with the belief that wind would carry sickness away. Doctors often made things worse. They didn't wash their hands or tools between patients. Surgical instruments were reused without sterilization. In maternity wards, women frequently died from childbed fever, a bacterial infection spread unknowingly by doctors who had just examined corpses. It wasn't until later in the century that pioneers like Joseph Lister and Ignaz Semmelweis began advocating for antiseptic practices. Yet even as city populations exploded, infrastructure lagged far behind. Thousands of people were crammed into tenement buildings, tiny, poorly ventilated apartments where entire families shared a single room. One privy might serve dozens of residents. Water pumps were few and often contaminated by nearby waste. In London's Soho district, a cholera outbreak in 1854 was traced to a single water pump by John Snow, one of the first to suggest that disease might be waterborne rather than airborne. But progress was slow. Politicians balked at the cost of sewer systems. Property owners resisted regulations. And many citizens had simply accepted the filth as normal. It took catastrophe to spark change. In 1858, the summer heat mixed with the open sewage of the Thames to produce a stench so horrific it became known as the Great Stink. Lawmakers were literally forced to flee Parliament. Only then did the government approve plans for a modern sewer network. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who became a sanitation hero. He designed a system of underground sewers that revolutionized London's infrastructure. His work didn't just make the city more pleasant, it saved thousands of lives. Similar projects followed in other major cities, but implementation took decades. For most Victorians, Daily life remained dirty and dangerous well into the late 1800s. Let's talk about water. Accessing clean water wasn't just a chore, it was a gamble. Many people relied on public pumps, wells, or cisterns. But without understanding contamination, these sources were often located near latrines or garbage heaps. Filtering or boiling water was uncommon. Milk, too, was often diluted with water that wasn't clean. Infant mortality soared. Food safety, practically non-existent. Meat was sold from open stalls, often swarming with flies. Dairy spoiled quickly. Bread might be improved with chalk or plaster to make it appear whiter. Vendors weren't inspected, and labeling was a joke. People didn't know what was in their food and often paid for it with their health. Preservatives were unregulated. Lead was used in candy coloring. Arsenic was sold in cosmetics. Dangerous chemicals were everywhere, from cleaning products to medicine. Children played with toys painted in lead-based dyes. Women applied makeup laced with mercury. Men used hair tonics containing industrial alcohols. The very things people thought were improving their lives were slowly poisoning them. And yet, there was pride in appearing clean, even if you weren't. Victorians went to great lengths to look presentable. Starched collars, polished boots, lacy gloves. Clothing may have reeked, but appearances had to be maintained. Public image trumped personal comfort. Servants played a huge role in managing the household mess, especially in upper-class homes. Chambermaids scrubbed chamber pots, emptied slop buckets, beat rugs, and hauled water. Laundry was a monumental task requiring boiling water, lye soap, scrubbing boards, and days of effort. Most people, especially women, were never not working. Public health reformers eventually began pushing for change. Organizations formed to study urban living conditions. Advocates published shocking exposés. Slowly, governments responded with new laws. Slum clearances, sanitation codes, food safety acts. By the end of the 19th century, things had started to improve, but only just so. The next time you flush a toilet or sip from a clean glass of water, think about what it took to get here. Think of the night soil men, the overworked mothers, the reformers who begged cities to value health over aesthetics, the engineers who built the pipes you never see. Hygiene didn't evolve overnight. It was demanded, fought for, and paid for in blood, sweat, and sewage. And while the Victorian age gave us museums, novels, and magnificent architecture, it also gave us a pungent reminder. Civilization isn't just measured by art and elegance, but by how it handles its waste. In some cities, waste removal took a darkly creative turn. Instead of just dumping human excrement, they found ways to monetize it. Night soil collectors would cart human waste out to the outskirts of town and sell it to farmers. That's right, sell it. It was spread directly onto crops as fertilizer, which means that the vegetables people served for supper were often grown in fields soaked with untreated human waste. Waste from a city ravaged by cholera, typhoid, and all sorts of pathogens. It was a closed-loop system of contamination, and nobody knew it. This grossly efficient recycling system seemed practical at the time. But when you stop to think about it, it makes you appreciate modern sanitation and agricultural regulations. Back then, organic wasn't a marketing term. It was a public health crisis waiting to happen. And yet, even this grotesque system wasn't sustainable. As urban populations exploded, the volume of waste outpaced the infrastructure meant to handle it. Farmers couldn't take it all. Cesspools overflowed. The streets reeked. The very air turned toxic in summer months. It was a sanitation disaster on a scale modern cities can scarcely imagine. So why did it take so long for meaningful reform to happen? Part of it was denial. People simply got used to the smell, the mess, and the sickness. It was just how things were. But another part was class division. The wealthy could escape the worst conditions, living in airier neighborhoods, hiring servants to manage the filth, and visiting countryside estates during the smelliest seasons. It was the poor who bore the brunt of the waste, disease, and death. This divide extended into medicine as well. The rich could afford private doctors, personal nurses, and cleaner surroundings. The poor had overcrowded hospitals, if they had anything at all. Medical charities existed, but they were underfunded and overwhelmed. Entire communities were left to suffer in silence, their needs invisible to the higher classes and lawmakers. Some reformers, however, began pushing for systemic change. Figures like Edwin Chadwick in England collected data on urban sanitation and presented damning reports to Parliament. His work showed the link between poverty, poor hygiene, and disease. He wasn't always right in his theories. He still believed in miasma, but his advocacy spurred infrastructure investment. Slowly, cities began building underground sewage systems. Public health boards were formed. Sanitation departments were created. Laws were passed requiring landlords to install privies and improve drainage. Street cleaning became a government duty rather than a private luxury. These measures didn't fix everything, but they helped stem the tide. Even architecture adapted. Tenement buildings were redesigned to include better ventilation and plumbing. Urban planning shifted to include more parks and open space, under the belief that fresh air could prevent disease. And it helped to some extent. Giving people access to cleaner air and more space didn't just improve physical health, it improved morale too. Schools got involved. Hygiene education became part of basic instruction. Children were taught to wash their hands, brush their teeth, and bathe when possible. Posters promoting cleanliness appeared in public spaces. Governments realized that keeping people healthy wasn't just a matter of charity. It was essential for national productivity, stability, and military readiness. Public baths were introduced in poorer neighborhoods. These weren't fancy spas. They were functional, no-nonsense bathing facilities where people could pay a small fee for access to hot water and soap. They offered dignity and relief to those who had gone without basic hygiene for too long. Meanwhile, new products began appearing in the market. Soaps became gentler, more affordable, and fragranced. Toothbrushes improved. Commercially produced toothpaste became available. Deodorants and shampoos were developed, slowly changing how people thought about their bodies. Advertising helped too. Hygiene became aspirational. Ads pitched cleanliness as a marker of modernity and respectability. Soap wasn't just for getting clean, it was for being civilized. While this created pressure, especially for women, it also raised awareness. People wanted to look and smell modern. Hospitals evolved as well. The rise of nursing as a respected profession, thanks in part to Florence Nightingale, brought order and cleanliness to medical care. Nightingale emphasized hand washing, ventilation, and the importance of sanitary conditions in preventing infection. Her influence spread through Europe and America, reshaping how healthcare was delivered. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated the shift. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, Robert Koch's identification of bacteria, and the invention of antiseptics revolutionized medicine and public health. Suddenly, disease wasn't a mysterious force. It had names, causes, and, eventually, cures. Vaccines were developed and distributed, slowly eradicating some of the most devastating illnesses. Smallpox, which had ravaged populations for centuries, was brought under control. Later came vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, and tuberculosis. But even as science advanced, superstition clung on. In rural areas and poorer neighborhoods, folk remedies and mistrust of doctors persisted. People turned to herbalists, spiritual healers, or dangerous quack treatments out of desperation or habit. And honestly, considering how bad early medicine was, you can't entirely blame them. Still, the trajectory was clear. Hygiene was no longer optional. It was essential. It became part of national identity, especially in industrializing nations competing for power. Clean cities, healthy soldiers, and long-living citizens became signs of progress. Children born at the end of the Victorian era entered a world slowly being transformed. Their schools had soap. Their homes had toilets. Their cities had sewer lines and waste collection. The air was a little cleaner, the water a little safer. It wasn't paradise, but it was better, and it would keep improving. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine how normal all that filth once was. But it was normal. It was accepted. People lived, loved, worked, and died in conditions we would consider unthinkable. And from that grime, a cleaner world was built. Bit by bit, law by law, bath by bath. So next time you see a bar of soap, a flushing toilet, or a sink with clean water, think of the people who didn't have those things. Think of the ones who demanded better, who shoveled waste in the dark, who fought for clean streets and safe milk. Hygiene didn't just happen. It was earned. And they didn't stop there. In the years that followed, London kept refining its sanitation systems. They constructed wastewater treatment plants, upgraded pumping stations, and extended sewer networks to reach more districts. Eventually, regulations were put in place to restrict what factories could discharge into public waterways. Bit by bit, one reform after another, the city evolved from a place infamous for its filth to one considered a model of cleanliness. Your breathing slows just thinking about it. That heavy, warm sense of relief settles in as you reflect on how profoundly a city's environment can change when people demand better, and when science, engineering, and political will come together. London's journey wasn't unique. Cities around the world followed suit. Paris revamped its water systems. Berlin introduced modern plumbing. New York began building its own underground sewer grid. Took decades, but the dominoes kept falling. The cleaner one city got, the more pressure there was on others to catch up. And it wasn't just infrastructure. Cleanliness itself became a cultural ideal. What was once a private, even taboo subject, bodily odors, waste, hygiene, was now public discourse. Sanitation became a matter of civic pride. A clean home, a clean street, a clean body. These were no longer luxuries or quirks. They were standards. The change was visible in architecture, too. Indoor plumbing became a selling point. Homes and apartments were retrofitted to accommodate sinks, toilets, and bathtubs. Faucets and tiled bathrooms were no longer signs of wealth. They were necessities. Floor plans changed to prioritize hygiene. Windows grew larger for ventilation. Kitchens were moved away from outhouses. Cleanliness was baked into the blueprint of modern life. Advertising shifted accordingly. Soaps weren't just for scrubbing. They were moral tools associated with virtue and social success. Posters and newspaper ads urged families to clean their homes, wash their hands, and buy branded hygiene products. The rise of the modern bathroom coincided with a rise in consumer culture. Cleanliness was marketable, sold well, and it didn't stop at the home. Public hygiene gained ground. Cities built public toilets. Street sweepers became full-time employees. Garbage collection evolved from an informal trade to a formal, regulated service. The scent of industrial cities changed. So did expectations. Hospitals became cleaner and more organized. Schools emphasized hand washing. Employers installed lavatories for their workers. Governments began requiring restaurants and markets to meet sanitation codes. Slowly but steadily, people began to expect hygiene not as an exception but as a right. And with expectation came habit. People started washing their hands before meals. Parents taught their children to bathe regularly. Bathing became a daily ritual, not a rare luxury. Brushing teeth became standard. So did trimming nails, washing clothes, and scrubbing floors. Children born into this world grew up with entirely different standards than their grandparents. They didn't just know how to use soap, they expected it. They didn't just hope for a clean toilet, they demanded it. And with every generation, the line of what was acceptable hygiene moved closer to what we now consider normal. But this new normal also came with its own pressures. Cleanliness was no longer just about health, it became tied to social status. A dirty child was assumed to come from a bad home. A smelly person was considered lazy or immoral. Entire judgments were made based on scent and appearance. As hygiene improved, so did surveillance. Women, especially, bore the brunt of this scrutiny. Mothers were held responsible for the cleanliness of the home. Wives were expected to manage sanitation silently and perfectly. Failure to do so invited shame. Magazines and etiquette manuals exploded with tips, rules, and diagrams showing how to clean, what to clean, and how often. The ideal home became a pristine temple of order. But this ideal was exhausting. It required time, money, and invisible labor, mostly from women. Cleanliness was empowering and imprisoning all at once. It granted health and dignity, but it also created impossible expectations. For every polished bathtub, there was someone working behind the scenes, unpaid or underpaid, to make it sparkle. This invisible labor continues today. Janitors, sanitation workers, caregivers, millions of people make modern hygiene possible, often without recognition. Their work is fundamental. Without them, cities revert. Hospitals become dangerous. Schools become breeding grounds. Yet their efforts are still too often undervalued. And then came public health campaigns. Governments realized hygiene wasn't just a personal issue, it was a national concern. Posters urged hand washing, vaccination, and pest control. Campaigns targeted everything from tuberculosis to lice. Soap became patriotic. Clean homes were equated with strong nations. In times of war, hygiene became a military priority. Soldiers were taught to maintain sanitation in trenches. Disease killed more than bullets in many conflicts. So armies began distributing soap, building latrines, and instructing troops in personal care. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved lives. In peace, too, hygiene played a role in social movements. Reformers pushed for housing improvements, access to running water, and workplace sanitation. Unions demanded safer, cleaner working conditions. Suffragettes argued that women needed political power to create healthier homes and cities. Cleanliness became a cause. Even religion joined in. Clergy preached that cleanliness is next to godliness. Churches offered laundry services, communal baths, and hygiene classes. Morality and cleanliness were fused into a single ideal. Being clean meant being good. And as technology advanced, so did the tools. Electric washing machines, water heaters, indoor plumbing, flush toilets, air conditioning, all changed how people approached cleanliness. What once took hours of labor now took minutes. What once required servants now needed only buttons. But the obsession with cleanliness also had unintended consequences. It led to the rise of harsh chemical cleaners, many of which harmed the environment. It fed consumerism, an endless cycle of buying, scrubbing, discarding, and buying again. It introduced fears of imperfection, dirt, and even bacteria that weren't dangerous. Still, it's hard to argue with the results. Life expectancy rose, child mortality dropped, diseases that once crippled cities became rare, clean water became expected, so did garbage pickup, indoor plumbing, and refrigeration. So the next time you enjoy a hot shower, toss dirty clothes in a washer, or drink straight from the tap, remember the long road it took to get here. It wasn't inevitable. It was built inch by inch, reform by reform, revolution by revolution. And while we still face challenges, access to hygiene isn't universal, and environmental concerns loom. We're far cleaner, healthier, and safer than those who came before us could have dreamed. Imagine lying on a table, fully awake, with nothing but a leather strap between your teeth and a swig of whiskey to numb what's coming next. That was surgery in the 1800s. Pain relief? Virtually non-existent. Anesthesia was still experimental, and many procedures were done with the patient conscious and screaming. Surgeons worked quickly, not because they were efficient, but because time meant agony. Surgery wasn't undertaken lightly. It was a last resort. If the alternative was certain death, only then would you consider going under the knife. And even then, surviving the operation didn't mean surviving what came after. Post-op infections were rampant, not because people didn't care, but because they simply didn't understand bacteria. Doctors had no concept of germ theory yet. They didn't wash their hands. They didn't sterilize tools. In fact, a surgeon's bloody coat was often seen as a badge of honor, a sign of experience. They'd go from dissecting corpses to delivering babies without so much as rinsing their fingers. Unsurprisingly, countless patients died not from the illness itself, but from the infection that followed treatment. Hospitals were overcrowded and grim. Ventilation was poor, cleanliness was inconsistent, and linens weren't regularly changed. If you were poor, you might end up in a charity hospital, understaffed, under-resourced, and dangerous. For many, being treated at home was safer than stepping inside a hospital ward. And yet, despite the risks, medicine began to evolve. Scientists and physicians were beginning to question traditional theories. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that doctors who washed their hands between patients, particularly between autopsies and childbirth, dramatically reduced death rates. He was mocked for it, ridiculed, dismissed. But he was right. Louis Pasteur proved that microorganisms caused fermentation and disease, giving birth to germ theory. Joseph Lister applied these ideas to surgery, using carbolic acid to clean wounds and instruments. His methods were revolutionary and controversial. Still, change was slow. Many doctors resisted new practices. Some believed it challenged their authority. Others simply didn't want to believe that they had been harming patients for years. It took decades, but eventually, antiseptic techniques became standard practice. The death toll began to fall. Anesthesia made its formal entrance. Ether and chloroform began to be used in the mid-1800s, transforming surgery from a traumatic ordeal into a manageable procedure. These drugs came with risks, overdoses, respiratory failure, but they opened doors. Suddenly, longer and more complex surgeries were possible. Internal procedures, tumor removals, cesarean sections. The field of surgery expanded rapidly. Meanwhile, stethoscopes became commonplace. So did thermometers. Microscopes gave scientists a glimpse into the microbial world. Bacteria were identified and classified. Diseases were no longer mysterious forces. They had names, patterns, and, increasingly, cures. The first vaccines emerged. Smallpox, which had plagued humanity for centuries, began to recede. By the end of the century, vaccines for rabies and anthrax were also developed. The dream of preventing illness, rather than just reacting to it, began to take root. And antibiotics, still a few decades away. People relied on folk remedies, herbal infusions, and prayer. Honey, garlic, willow bark, sometimes they helped. Often they didn't. Infection remained one of the greatest killers. Public health began to matter. Clean water, improved nutrition, better housing, all contributed to healthier populations. Cities started funding medical clinics. Nurses became professionalized. Hygiene moved from fringe theory to foundational principle. And yet, the journey wasn't linear. Misinformation flourished. Quack doctors advertised miracle cures. Mercury pills were common. Opium was handed out like candy. Cocaine was used in tonics and children's cough syrup. Some treatments were worse than the diseases they were supposed to fix. Mental health care was in its own dark age. People with mental illness were often confined in asylums, out of sight, out of mind. Treatments included isolation, physical restraints, and even ice baths. Compassion was rare, understanding even rarer. Women's health was particularly misunderstood. Conditions like hysteria were diagnosed based on outdated notions of femininity and morality. Doctors prescribed rest, isolation, or marriage as cures. Women's pain was routinely dismissed or ignored. Despite this, some pioneers emerged. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to receive a medical degree in the U.S. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing and hospital design. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross. Their work laid the groundwork for a more compassionate, effective medical system. Medical education improved, too. Universities introduced stricter standards. Anatomy was studied systematically. Exams became more rigorous. Over time, the distinction between trained physicians and charlatans became clearer. But access remained unequal. The poor still struggled to afford care. Rural areas lacked doctors. Racism and classism shaped who received treatment and who didn't. Medicine was advancing, but justice lagged behind. Still, the foundation had been laid. A world where illness was no longer a death sentence, where pain could be managed, where healing didn't rely on guesswork alone. That world wasn't quite here yet, but it was coming. By the turn of the century, the contrast was stark. A person born in 1800 might have gone their entire life without anesthesia, antibiotics, or clean surgery. A child born in 1900 entered a world on the cusp of medical revolution. We owe our modern comforts to centuries of trial, error, and sacrifice. To the doctors who dared to question, the scientists who stayed up late with microscopes, the nurses who cleaned infected wounds with bare hands, and yes, even the patients who endured it all. So next time you take an ibuprofen, get a vaccine, or have a routine surgery, think about what it used to mean. Think of the whiskey, the leather strap, and the surgeon in a bloody apron. Then look at your clean hospital room, your sterile equipment, your anesthesiologist, and be grateful. Because modern medicine isn't just about technology. It's about empathy, knowledge, and hard-won progress. A soft yawn slips out, and you can't help but feel a wave of appreciation for modern food safety standards. Seriously, refrigerators, expiration dates, pasteurization, we take them for granted. But back then, preserving food was a gamble, and losing meant food poisoning or worse. Pickling was a go-to method. Vegetables were soaked in vinegar or brine for weeks, sometimes months. Onions, cabbage, cucumbers, eggs, even meats were submerged in acidic solutions to kill bacteria and keep them edible. And while it worked, the result wasn't exactly gourmet. Imagine eating pickled everything day in, day out. Vinegar became a lifestyle, a tangy, monotonous, digestive challenging lifestyle. Then there were the truly desperate approaches. People would literally just eat food that was past its prime. Slightly slimy meat? Just scrape off the green bits. Moldy bread? Toast it. Sour milk? Cook it into pudding. If it wasn't visibly crawling, it was probably dinner. Preservation methods were crude. Salt curing was used for meats, which often made them dry, tough, and overpoweringly salty. Smoking was another option, though it was time-consuming and inconsistent. Drying fruit or meat took sunny weather and patience. Spoilage was common. So were parasites. Flies were constant companions in kitchens. Meat hung from ceiling hooks, sometimes draped with cheesecloth, sometimes left entirely exposed. Insects laid eggs in rotting food. People developed an unsettling tolerance for the occasional maggot or worm. Just pick it out and carry on. Milk was a microbial playground. There was no refrigeration, no pasteurization. It spoiled fast. Children got sick. Infant mortality was directly linked to contaminated dairy. In cities, milk was often diluted with water that wasn't clean to begin with. And in an effort to improve appearance, vendors sometimes added chalk to whiten it. Butter was churned by hand, stored in cellars, and easily went rancid. Eggs were kept in lime water or wax to slow decay. Bread went stale within a day or two, growing mold if not consumed fast. Even clean water was unreliable. Wells were frequently contaminated by nearby waste. Rain barrels collected debris and insects. Boiling helped, but few did it consistently. Canned food existed but was in its infancy. Early canning processes weren't always reliable. Some cans exploded from gas buildup. Others were improperly sealed, leading to botulism outbreaks. But it was progress. Tin cans slowly became more common in the mid to late 19th century, offering a safer, though still questionable, option. Cooking itself was often improvised. Stoves were wood or coal burning. Heat was uneven. There were no timers, no thermometers. Recipes were vague, passed down verbally or handwritten with approximations like a good handful or bake until done. Food was undercooked or overcooked, or both. Kitchens were smoky, hot, and labor-intensive. Washing dishes meant hauling water, heating it, and scrubbing with lye soap. There were no sponges, no dish racks, no antibacterial sprays. Just elbow grease and the hope that food remnants wouldn't draw rodents. And speaking of pests, mice, rats, and cockroaches were just part of the household ecosystem. Traps were crude. Poison worked, but was dangerous to humans, too. People stored food in tins or hung it from the ceiling. But rodents always found a way, especially in tenement housing, where filth and overcrowding created a buffet for vermin. For many families, food insecurity was a daily reality. You ate what you could afford. Meat was a luxury. Stew stretched scraps into meals. Bread filled bellies. Vegetables came from gardens if you were lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, street vendors sold wilted produce and bruised fruit. Hunger was common. Malnutrition was normal. Meals lacked variety. Breakfast might be porridge. Lunch, bread and cheese. Dinner, a boiled root vegetable and maybe a piece of meat once a week. Desserts? Rare. Sugar was expensive. Candy was a treat for special occasions, often made at home from molasses or honey. Food quality varied wildly between classes. The wealthy enjoyed imported spices, fresh meats, fine china, and dedicated kitchens staffed with servants. The poor made do with scraps, cheap cuts, and makeshift cooking equipment. For some, a single pot served as both cookware and tableware. Despite the challenges, food brought people together. Community meals, Sunday roasts, holiday feasts, they were cherished because they were rare. Sharing food, even humble fare, was a gesture of love and survival. And amid all this, there were glimmers of culinary creativity. People found ways to make do. Spices were stretched. Leftovers were repurposed. Pies concealed questionable fillings. Soups extended meager ingredients. Necessity bred innovation. The late 19th century brought slow improvements. Iceboxes appeared in middle-class homes. Grocery stores began offering more reliable products. Sanitation laws were introduced. Food adulteration, once common, was exposed and regulated. Labels improved. So did public awareness. The invention of refrigeration changed everything. Suddenly, food could be stored safely for longer. Spoilage dropped. Variety increased. Freshness became a possibility, not just a dream. And from there, modern food culture began to emerge. But it's worth remembering where we came from. The next time you toss out a container of slightly wilted spinach or microwave a perfectly balanced meal, think about the generations who survived on pickled cabbage and boiled gristle, who scraped mold off bread and hoped it didn't kill them. Their grit, their resourcefulness, their tolerance for tangy, dubious food paved the way for the convenience we now enjoy. And it makes you appreciate that expiration date just a little more. Better soap and new grooming products were slowly hitting the market, but old beliefs lingered. Even wealthy households, fully capable of affording daily bathing, often skipped it out of habit. Many had grown up with the notion that frequent washing was dangerous. that it weakened the body, opened the pores to disease, or sapped one's strength. These outdated medical ideas had a long shelf life. For the working class, hygiene remained a challenge of time and money. If you were laboring 14-hour shifts in a soot-choked factory, barely earning enough to eat, who had time or cash for a long bath, soap, clean clothes, and rest were luxuries you could only dream about. Personal hygiene was often sacrificed just to survive another day. But slowly, public perceptions began to shift. Cleanliness became a marker of morality, self-respect, and even patriotism. People were told that staying clean meant you were disciplined and modern. Campaigns encouraged daily bathing and hand washing. Posters appeared in schools and workplaces. Governments and reformers began pushing hygiene as a public good, not just a personal one. Still, habits take time to break. Some people resisted these changes. Others embraced them halfway, washing only hands and face or cleaning on special occasions. Public bathhouses became more common, especially in urban areas, offering hot water and soap for a small fee. These communal spaces gave lower-income families access to basic hygiene and, occasionally, a sense of dignity. At the same time, industry began to capitalize on this cultural shift. Companies marketed cleanliness as sophistication. Soap ads featured upper-class women in spotless white dresses or men dabbing cologne in wood-paneled studies. These weren't just hygiene products, they were status symbols. Shampoo, deodorant, toothpaste all began to evolve. Early versions were crude. Lye-based soaps, baking soda pastes, or powders applied with cloth. But they improved rapidly. Formulas became gentler, scents more pleasant, and packaging more attractive. Brands rose to prominence by aligning with modern ideals: purity, order, freshness. Toothbrushes changed too. From bone and pig bristle tools to mass-produced plastic handles and nylon bristles. Toothpaste came in jars, then tubes. Dental hygiene became routine. Schools taught children to brush daily. Dentists began offering advice, not just extractions. Hair care followed. Hairbrushes were redesigned. Tonics promised shine and growth. Some worked. Others were glorified snake oil. But the desire to care for one's appearance, once seen as vain, was reframed as responsible. A well-groomed person was healthy, respectable, and in control. Clothing hygiene also improved. Laundering became more common. Washing machines appeared, first hand-cranked, then electric. Stains were still a problem, but now there were solutions. Bleach, bluing agents, and detergents. Fabric care labels and laundry guides taught people how to maintain garments properly. Clean clothing no longer signaled wealth, it signaled effort, pride. As hygiene became democratized, so did fashion. People could present themselves neatly regardless of income, provided they had access to the basics. Workplaces caught on too. Employers realized that dirty, unhealthy employees were less productive. Factory owners began installing wash basins. Some offered uniforms that could be laundered. In white-collar offices, dress codes emphasized pressed shirts, polished shoes, and well-kept hair. Hygiene was professionalism. Schools became hygiene hubs. Children were taught not only arithmetic and grammar, but also cleanliness. Posters lined walls with smiling children brushing teeth, scrubbing hands, and keeping fingernails clean. These messages shaped entire generations. Even architecture responded. Homes were designed with built-in bathrooms, ventilation systems, and kitchens built for sanitation. Materials shifted to tile, porcelain, and linoleum, surfaces that were easy to clean. Housing codes enforced minimum standards. It wasn't just about beauty anymore, it was about health. And beneath it all was the idea that humans could and should take control of their environment. Clean water, clean air, clean skin. The new vision of modernity wasn't just powered by steam or electricity. It was scrubbed, disinfected, and lemon-scented. But the pressure to appear clean came with costs. Working-class families faced judgment if their homes weren't spotless. Women, in particular, bore the burden. A dirty child, a stained shirt, or an unkempt room reflected not on the family's poverty, but on the mother's failure. Magazines reinforced these ideals. So did fiction. The ideal housewife wasn't just nurturing. She was pristine. Her floors gleamed. Her children's ears were clean. Her linens were freshly pressed. Never mind that she did it all without modern appliances and often without help. Cleanliness became not just a habit but a performance, a way to navigate social mobility. Immigrant families, especially, were pressured to adopt hygiene standards as a sign of assimilation. To be clean was to be civilized. To be dirty was to be other. This mindset wasn't just classist, it was deeply racialized. Public health campaigns often portrayed cleanliness as a white virtue. Minorities were depicted as unhygienic, backward, or dangerous. Racist stereotypes shaped everything from immigration laws to school policies. Soap became a symbol of cultural superiority. And yet, these ideals also brought real improvements. Disease rates dropped. Children grew up stronger. Life expectancy increased. The spread of lice, cholera, and typhoid slowed. The world smelled better, looked better, and felt safer. The cost was a new kind of anxiety, a fear of being judged for smelling off, a pressure to clean obsessively, the rise of clean freaks and germaphobes. We created a world where people apologized for sweating, for body hair, for smelling like a human. Even so, we didn't stop. We doubled down, invented stronger detergents, built brighter bathrooms, turned cleaning into a lifestyle and a billion-dollar industry. And as you sit here now, maybe freshly showered, maybe brushing your hair as this story plays, you're part of that legacy, a product of generations who scrubbed, innovated, and redefined what it means to be clean. Science was making serious strides. Thanks to pioneers like Louis Pasteur, people were beginning to grasp a revolutionary idea. Illness didn't stem from sin, bad luck, or foul smells. It came from tiny, invisible organisms, germs. This new understanding flipped the entire concept of disease on its head. Suddenly, hygiene wasn't just about being polite or looking clean. It became a matter of life and death. Hand-washing wasn't just good manners, it was essential. Cleaning a wound properly could prevent sepsis and death. Proper food storage and safe preparation weren't just about taste anymore, they saved lives. For the first time, people were learning how to protect themselves in ways that actually worked. This shift wasn't instant, of course. The public was skeptical. Old habits died hard. But once germ theory took hold, it began influencing everything. Medicine, public health, even architecture. Hospitals became cleaner, doctors started sterilizing instruments, and midwives were taught to wash their hands. Governments got involved. Campaigns urged citizens to wash regularly, clean their homes, and cook food thoroughly. Posters lined city walls. Schools drilled hygiene lessons into students. What began as fringe science turned into public policy. And this new knowledge filtered down into daily life. Kitchens were redesigned to be cleaner and more efficient. Bathrooms became central features of homes. Toothbrushes, soap, and fresh linens became part of the expected household toolkit. People started boiling water before drinking it. They threw out spoiled food. They stopped reusing bathwater. The home itself became a battlefield against germs. This didn't just reduce disease, it reshaped daily routines. Morning hygiene became a ritual. Wash face, brush teeth, change into fresh clothes. Nighttime hygiene followed a similar script. Cleanliness wasn't seasonal or occasional anymore. It was daily, even hourly. The idea of personal space evolved, too. The rise of germ theory helped define boundaries. People became more cautious about physical contact, especially with strangers. Sharing cups, towels, or razors suddenly seemed dangerous. Illness was no longer random, it had rules, and those rules changed everything. Cleanliness also started to shape language. Phrases like clean living, clean conscience, or clean break became common. Dirty began to imply more than just mud. It meant danger, corruption, or moral failure. Being clean became a metaphor for being good, safe, and trustworthy. Religion adapted as well. Sermons about spiritual purity began including references to literal cleanliness. Churches built wash stations. Rituals that had once symbolized inner purity now had medical backing. Holy water met hand sanitizer. Business followed suit. The growing middle class embraced the new cleanliness as a mark of respectability. Employers expected workers to look presentable. Employees expected clean workspaces. Uniforms were laundered. Tools were wiped down. Hygiene was no longer extra, it was expected. Advertising leaned hard into this. Commercials didn't just promise good smells, they promised peace of mind. Kills 99.9% of germs became a selling point. Soap was heroic. Toothpaste fought decay. Deodorant conquered shame. Companies sold safety in bottles, boxes, and bars. And the consumer played along. People wanted that safety. They built routines around it. They taught their kids about it. They judged others based on it. Hygiene became a cultural performance, a way of signaling that you belonged. But even good ideas can be taken too far. Obsession with cleanliness spawned anxiety. People began fearing not just dirt, but all mess, all imperfection. Children were scolded for getting muddy. Women were shamed for stained aprons. Men avoided physical labor that left them sweaty. Cleanliness became a rigid standard. This created problems of its own. Excessive hand-washing led to cracked skin and infection. Overuse of harsh cleaners damaged lungs and the environment. Antibacterial everything contributed to resistant microbes. The war against germs, in some cases, made them stronger. Still, the benefits were undeniable. Cities grew healthier. Epidemics became rarer. Families lost fewer children. Life expectancy climbed. The simple act of washing your hands had become one of humanity's greatest health achievements. Schools doubled down. Hygiene classes became standard. Students learned to identify germs, wash properly, and avoid contamination. These lessons stuck. Generations grew up internalizing them, passing them on to their kids and grandkids. Even pop culture got in on the act. Books, cartoons, and movies began showing characters brushing teeth, washing faces, and using tissues. Hygiene became not just a practice, but part of storytelling. And as the 20th century dawned, the focus on cleanliness shaped entire industries. The home appliance boom brought dishwashers, laundry machines, and vacuum cleaners. Hotels advertised pristine sheets. Restaurants flaunted health scores. Airlines touted filtered air. Everyone wanted to prove they were clean. Cleanliness had gone global. International campaigns fought diseases with soap and water. Aid workers distributed hygiene kits. NGOs drilled wells and built latrines. Hygiene became a tool for diplomacy, development, and disaster relief. But inequality persisted. Not everyone benefited equally. In rural areas and poorer nations, access to clean water and sanitation remained scarce. Wars and climate change disrupted infrastructure. Slums swelled. The same old struggles, disease, dirt, and death, remained stubbornly in place for millions. And so the fight continued. Hygiene, once a personal responsibility, became a collective one. Public good, something worth funding, teaching, and protecting. And though we've come a long way, we're not done yet.